The one bit of advice I'd give anybody that's just starting out or just thinking about building a model railway is avoid lift sections like the plague. Sometimes, however, they are a necessary evil. I've ended up with a double lift section on part of my railway, and the reasons for that will become apparent in a future video. Now, I'm well aware that there are products on the market that are here to help and aid us, as the one shown in the picture and linked in the description. I use PCB board, which is slightly cheaper and a bit old school. Again, I'm aware that you can buy this stuff pre-cut, but since I've got the tools to cut it myself, I do. This is also one of the rare occasions I've been taught something and actually listened. I cut them into strips 5mm by 40 and then drill a 1mm hole in each end. Now there's two ways of doing this. The easiest is on plain track, so we'll do that one first. First of all, we'll identify the joint and then get where we want to put our track and mark it out. Now it doesn't matter if you lay your track on just the bare board or on cork. Some say if you use cork you need an extra bit of hardwood at the end. I've never found that an issue, and I don't use it. To help us get a nice flush edge, we'll attach a piece of wood to the end of the board, glue our piece of cork and then butt it up to that piece of wood. We can then glue and pin our little bit of PCB board. Now I don't think it's necessary to actually pin it, I just like the extra security. The pins only need to be nipped up. They don't need to be hammered in so far that it distorts the board. PVA glue is more than adequate, and it will set hard enough to create a strong, solid bond. We then take the piece of wood off the end of the board and then repeat the process on the other side. Then we can get our piece of track, mark out which sleepers need to be chopped out, normally 3. It's not second hand because it's mine. No, it should be obvious that I'm using reclaimed track. Therefore, once we get the sleepers out, I'll need to clean the bottom of the rail to give the solder somewhere to stick to. And that will go for the outside web of the rail as well. After squeezing the sleepers up a little bit to make it easier to camouflage the joint, I then fix the track into place with some pins. Watching this back in editing reminds me I must get some new soldering iron tips. Obviously the next thing we do is solder our rails to our PCB board sleepers. My Dremel is one of my best tools and I love it to bits, but I wouldn't cut the rails at this point with it, because unless the disc is wider than the body of your cutting thing, then you're always going to get an angled cut, which sometimes makes the join too big. So to get a nice square-ish cut on the rail, I use a razor saw. Now, if your woodwork is so good that you can't get a razor saw between the baseboard joints, you really shouldn't be watching this. With the baseboard separated, I then go in with a flat file to file the rails flat, using the baseboard edge as a guide. That way you get a nice joint that is flush with the end. Now I'm going to go off at a tangent here, because I think it is quite important to get a nice edge on your baseboard when we're doing this. Now I'm no carpenter, and I've struggled in the past with saw cuts not being straight or square. So I'll just take a minute to impart my limited knowledge on how to get one straight and square by showing you my other favourite tool, which was a £30 power saw from B&Q. Now just because you got one of these still doesn't mean to say you can cut in a straight line. So I use a wooden guide rail always, firstly measuring from the edge of your platform to the blade, and then transferring that measurement to the woodwork that you're doing. So this one is 91 millimeters. So that's an extra, so it's whatever you're cutting off plus 91 millimeters. Then you put your batten down, put your saw against the batten, and then gently push away and cut the desired piece off, leaving hopefully a nice straight square edge. Now back to joints, and the second method that I use normally entails butting a point up against the baseboard edge. So as before, I'm going to be using some reclaimed second-hand points. So the first thing is to cut one sleeper off of the back and then clean the underneath, ready for some solder. Then we'll mark out as before, placing a stop on the end of the baseboard to give us a nice flush edge to work off. Gluing and pinning our piece of PCB board on either side. Then with the point pushed up against the stop and pinned in place, we can then solder it into position. If anybody's interested, I've got asbestos transplants on the end of my fingers so it doesn't get hot. Well, not much anyway. The piece of track on the other baseboard is then offered up, pinned in place and then soldered. And doing it this way, where you've got a break in the rail before you solder, it's quite easy to get a sort of a peak, sort of ridge effect, which is easily cured by having a ruler on hand just to make sure that the rail is completely flat. Once we've soldered up both sides, it's always worth getting the file out and just making sure there's no rough edges, burrs or anything that's likely to catch when we put the two baseboards back together. Now, because we've used PCB board, which has copper on one side, obviously because we've soldered to it, we need to make sure that the two sides are separated, or the two rails are separated. So I used to use a triangular file and file a notch in the PCB board, but these days I tend to use the Dremel and just grind away the copper until it exposes the whatever the board is made out of. I'm sure somebody will tell me in the comments below. As I said at the beginning, my recommendation would be to try and avoid these sort of joints as much as possible. However, I seem to be a bit of a sadist when it comes to joints on lifting sections. I'll leave a link in the description below for the bits and pieces that I know about that manufacturers do produce to help and aid this process. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.